Few stories in rock history carry the emotional weight of the friendship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. On the surface, they appeared to be two boys from Liverpool, united by a shared love of music, growing together into legends. But beneath that image of harmony lay a relationship far more complicated, shaped by loyalty, creative rivalry, unspoken resentment, and ultimately a profound and enduring brotherhood that only revealed its true depth in the quietest of moments. Their story begins not on a grand stage, but on an ordinary bus route through Liverpool. When the two first crossed paths at the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys around 1954, they were drawn together not by academic ambition, but by something far more powerful: music. Paul, a year older, was already sharp-witted and musically curious, having learned piano through formal training and absorbed his father Jim McCartney's love of jazz. George, quieter and more restless in the rigid school environment, had already begun filling his notebooks with drawings of guitars and practicing until his fingertips ached. When George spotted Paul with a guitar one day, a 3-hour conversation about music erupted between them, and a lifelong bond was born. Both boys were captivated by the American rock and roll explosion sweeping across their generation. Elvis Presley, Buddy Holly, and Little Richard ignited something in them that no classroom lesson ever could. George later described how hearing Heartbreak Hotel struck him like lightning, pushing him to practice with a discipline that belied his young age. By 1956, George had already joined a local skiffle group called the Rebels. A year later, Paul had been welcomed into John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, and he quickly recognized that George possessed the raw talent to join them as lead guitarist. Lennon was initially skeptical. George seemed too young, too babyface for the group, but George settled the debate on a Liverpool bus by playing a flawless version of the rockabilly instrumental Raunchy. From that moment, the essential trio was complete. Those early years were filled with the kind of closeness that only shared dreams can create. The three boys spent countless hours playing chords together, imagining a future beyond Liverpool. For Paul, who had lost his mother at the age of 14, this friendship was more than musical fellowship. It was a source of stability and belonging. For George, it was confirmation that his talent was real, that he belonged among serious musicians. What they were building, though none of them could have known it then, would change the course of popular music forever. As the Beatles ascended from Liverpool club favorites to global superstars through the early and mid-1960s, the dynamics within the band began to shift in ways that would eventually fracture friendships. Paul's natural confidence and relentless perfectionism made him the de facto creative leader of the group. His vision drove the band's sound and direction, and his partnership with John Lennon produced an almost unstoppable songwriting machine. George, for all his growing talent, found himself increasingly squeezed out. The Lennon-McCartney writing credit dominated Beatles releases, and George's compositions were routinely sidelined or treated as afterthoughts, no matter how much depth and originality they carried. The strain became unmistakable during the recording of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967, widely regarded as Paul's artistic vision brought to life. George contributed, Within You Without You, a deeply personal piece rooted in Indian music and philosophy that reflected his immersion in spirituality. To the rest of the band, it was simply another track on a concept album. To George, it was a declaration of who he was becoming, an artist searching for meaning far beyond commercial success. Their priorities were pulling them in opposite directions, and no amount of shared history could entirely bridge that gap. The divergence deepened dramatically during the Beatles' trip to India in early 1968. George embraced meditation and the teachings of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi as genuinely life-changing. Paul approached the entire experience more casually, treating it largely as a creative retreat. When Paul attempted to lighten the atmosphere with a joking remark, "Calm down, Georgie boy," it only highlighted how little he understood what the journey meant to George. For George, spirituality was not a phase or an interesting diversion. It was central to his identity, and Paul's dismissiveness stung deeply. By 1969, the tension had reached its breaking point. The recording sessions for what would become the Let It Be album were caught on camera, exposing a band that was visibly coming apart. Paul's tendency to direct and control in the studio had grown more pronounced, and George's patience, long mistaken by others for quiet acceptance, had finally run out. In one raw and now famous exchange, George told Paul plainly, "I'll play whatever you want to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was not a tantrum. It was the sound of years of frustration reaching their limit. George had quietly accumulated a remarkable collection of songs during those years. Compositions including All Things Must Pass, Isn't It a Pity, and Run of the Mill, all of which had been consistently rejected in favor of Lennon-McCartney material. The exclusion was not merely professional, it was personal. On January 10, 1969, George walked out of the sessions entirely, describing the atmosphere as deeply unhealthy and impossible to endure. He stayed away for 12 days. The band, recognizing how essential he was to their balance, eventually coaxed him back, but the fracture lines were permanent. That same year, even as their relationship deteriorated, George produced some of the most celebrated songs in Beatles history. Abbey Road, the band's final recorded album, featured Here Comes the Sun and Something, the latter prompting Frank Sinatra to call it the greatest love song ever written. Even John Lennon declared it the finest track on the album. For George, the recognition was long overdue vindication. He had spent years being treated as a secondary figure in his own band, and now the world was hearing what he had always known about himself. Yet behind the scenes, the success brought more friction than peace. Paul felt the shift in creative power and found it unsettling, while George resented the continued interference in his arrangements. When the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, Paul and George embarked on solo careers that reflected just how different they had always been. George channeled years of suppressed creativity into All Things Must Pass, a sprawling triple album that announced him as one of the most significant songwriters of his generation. Songs like Run of the Mill carried what seemed like direct references to the fractured friendship, with lines wondering how a close bond had been lost. Paul, meanwhile, launched a commercially successful solo career and formed Wings, chasing the kind of mainstream recognition that George had grown to distrust. Throughout the 1970s, their contact was sporadic and often cool. George stated openly in interviews that he could imagine playing with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. The remark cut deeply, even as Paul maintained a composed public face. When George organized the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, he invited Paul to join him, a genuine gesture of connection. Paul declined, citing logistical concerns. The opportunity for a public reconciliation slipped away, and the distance between them widened further. The slow thaw began during the 1980s and accelerated into the 1990s. Paul began publicly acknowledging what he had perhaps always known privately, that George was an extraordinary songwriter, someone he had underestimated during their Beatles years. It was a quiet but significant admission, reflecting a maturity that both men were gradually growing into. In February 1994, Paul, George, and Ringo Starr reunited at Paul's studio to work on unfinished John Lennon demo recordings. The project, which produced the songs Free, As a Bird, and Real Love, was emotionally charged from the beginning. George insisted on bringing in his friend Jeff Lynne as producer, warning that without an outside hand, the sessions could spiral into chaos given the history and the egos involved. He told Paul, directly, "No, we need a producer. It could be dangerous just to get in the studio, could get nasty. You've got egos flying around." It was a candid acknowledgement of everything they had been through, and proof that their dynamic, for all its complications, was at least now something they could speak about honestly. They disagreed throughout the sessions, as they always had, Paul wanting an authentic Beatles sound, George preferring something simpler and more understated. But they completed the work, and the music that emerged served as a bridge between the past and the present, a gift to the fans who had never stopped hoping for exactly that. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. He survived, but subsequent battles with lung cancer and a brain tumor gradually weakened him. In 1999, he was brutally attacked by an intruder at his Friar Park home, leaving him physically diminished though spiritually unbroken. Through these trials, Paul visited when he could. The guardedness that had defined so much of their adult relationship began to dissolve in the face of mortality. Their final meetings carried a tenderness that had been absent for decades. Paul recalled sitting beside George in a New York hospital room, the two of them joking and laughing like boys again, trading stories from a shared past that stretched back more than 40 years. At one point, they held hands, a gesture so simple, and yet so unlike anything they might have done in their younger, more guarded years. It was the quiet completion of something long unfinished, a reconciliation not spoken in grand declarations, but expressed in the small, honest moments that define real friendship. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His ashes were scattered in the sacred waters of the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, a final expression of the spiritual devotion that had shaped his life and music. His posthumous album Brainwashed, released in 2002, stood as a moving testament to his enduring creativity and depth of feeling. Paul was devastated by the loss, not simply of a bandmate or a creative rival, but of someone who had been woven into the fabric of his life since childhood. In the years since, he has honored George's memory in personal and quietly beautiful ways, whispering greetings to a tree George planted near his home, nurturing the friendship between their children, and speaking about George with a warmth and candor that earlier years rarely allowed. The story of Paul McCartney and George Harrison is ultimately not a story of rivalry or bitterness, though those elements were real and lasting. It is a story about the extraordinary complexity of human connection, about how two people can frustrate, disappoint, and underestimate each other across decades, and still find their way back to something true. Their bond, forged on a Liverpool bus by two boys talking about music, proved strong enough to survive fame, fracture, and time itself. Beneath the legend was simply a friendship, imperfect, tested, and ultimately unbreakable.